hope you've got something to eat and something to drink, as this video is going to be quite a long one. I've deliberately kept it long as I know a lot of you have been looking forward to the video where I start doing the scenery. Well, that moment has come, and as you can see, I've managed to get a fair bit done on this particular area. It's not finished, but I've got quite far. There will be a future video to finish up further detail and scenery work in this area. So let's hand over to myself back in January when I made a start on building the scenery here. Before we even get anywhere near planning where the buildings are going to go, I need to start laying some of the base terrain. The very rough plan at the moment is, you can sort of see it starting to build up already. This is going to be an embankment following the branch line, and because the branch line is on a gradient, the embankment will gradually reduce and should be quite a nice effect, especially looking over the rooftops of various buildings, looking through alleyways and gardens and stuff. This is some 50mm Celotex insulation. It's left over from insulating this room, which I did back in 2017, and I kept all of the offcuts from doing that job, as I knew they were going to be extremely useful for landscaping on the layout when I eventually built it. Okay, I'm going to start gluing down some of the foam. You can see I've got some weights in the background working on another piece. It's a good idea to put some weight onto the foam as it dries, just to ensure a good bond and make sure the foam dries reasonably flat. And you can see I've also stopped and started the foam at a join in the tables. Again, generally good practice. Although this is a permanent layout, I'd like to try and make it as easy to dismantle as possible. Right, the glue has now dried, and I'm now ready to start carving out the embankment that I want to run along the side of the branch. Okay, well, quite a bit of mess later, and we have something resembling a man-made embankment. And I've just glued one of the offcuts from that area up there to here, to just allow the embankment to nicely follow the gradient of the track. Okay, so I'm going to start planning what's going to go in this area. Now, the original thought was to use these Bachmann Scencraft detached houses. They are quite a nice model, and I have 5 of them, so that was the first thought I had, but the space is somewhat limited. A little bit predictable. Most people's first thought when putting some scenery down is perhaps all houses. We've already got houses going on over there, and then the beginnings of Canal Scene Part 2, so the canal provides a nice scenic break to perhaps divide residential from, say, industry. So the current thinking is to do some sort of automotive related industry, and at the moment I'm specifically thinking of something like British car auctions. So we can have an open area filled with cars, people going around looking at the cars and deciding which ones they're going to try and bid on, and we can also then have over somewhere on here, the industrial unit where everybody gathers when the auction's underway and the cars get driven into that building. They get auctioned, and then the people that win them pay their money and take them off down the road, provided they bought a car that actually works. Again, looking at the area, taking things into consideration, we've got a canal here blocking development, we've got a railway here blocking development, we've got a strange plot of land. You might not want to build houses here, you're very close to the railway, you're very close to the canal, so something like a car auction would be the sort of industry that you would expect to spring up in a strange area like this. So we'll have a relatively narrow road running along the side of the embankment, down the side of the car auction to the facilities point for the canal, so that the facilities point can be supplied, and it will also allow visitors to the car auction somewhere to park along the curbside on the road. Okay, well, I've carried on planning, roughing out where things are going to go, taking into account the width of the road in the background, pavement, and any space over there for the facilities point for the canal. This building does not represent the final building that's going to go for the auction, but it is about the sort of size that I would like the building to be. So I have temporarily placed that there just to give me an indication of how things might look. So plenty of scope for this scene. I think it's something a little bit different, a little bit interesting. So now I'm happy with the approximate layout of what things are going to look like. We can carry on with the scenery. So now I'm going to build up the initial texture on the embankment that you can see in front of you. The plain foam on its own is not great. It won't really paint very well. It needs a nice realistic looking surface. So for the first time I have got myself some Sculpt mould, and I'm going to have a play with that. I've not used it before, but I've seen it used to incredible effect in other videos. The instructions say this should be mixed 2 parts Sculpt mould to 1 part water. I'm just doing it by eye. So it's been about 15 minutes, and now what I can do is start to smooth off some of the imperfections and particularly rough areas. Now at the end of the day you can choose what sort of finish you want. You may be quite happy with that finish, especially if you're doing something like a rock face. As this is a man-made, relatively shallow embankment, being man-made, it's going to have a degree of smoothness and uniformity to it. So you can see I've just started to smooth it out. But at the end of the day there are still ruts and high and low spots to give that layer of variation that I'm after. But it's up to you what sort of finish you go for. I'd like it a bit smoother than how it looks at the moment. So to do that, just simply spray a bit of water onto the surface and then just rub your finger into it, and you basically re-dissolve the very top layer of the sort of plastery material that it's made of, which allows you to smooth it out. Okay, well, it might be difficult to make out on camera as it is white, but I'm much happier with the finish now, and I could keep going if I wanted to and make it even smoother. Okay, it's been quite a few days, as the Sculptor mod takes a long time to dry if the temperature is a bit cold, and as it's winter time it's not exactly super warm, so it does take a while to dry. So I've left it to do its thing, and it's now ready to be painted. So that's the next thing I'm going to do. I'm just going to paint this in a basic matte brown as a sort of base for my scenery. While it was drying, I ordered a load of stuff from Scale Model Scenery, so we got some bits and pieces to go specifically for the canal here. It's talking about having a security fence around the car auction. Well, I found that, and I thought, well, that was going to be perfect. That's the sort of security fence that I was looking for. Also got things like drains, and I've also got some of the Great Western style line side fencing. I thought that would look quite good, running along the edge of the branch line at the top of this embankment. So you'll see those in more detail later on. For now, I'm going to get started on painting this embankment. The paint I'm using is this acrylic burnt umber. I actually bought this in Hobbycraft and it didn't have a price on it, and I was a bit shocked when I got to the till. It was quite expensive for a tin of paint, but having just used it, I'm very impressed. Extremely good covering power, and when you actually pour it out of the container, it's extremely thick and it has to be thinned down before you even use it. So it's going to last ages, and it should do quite a lot of the terrain around various parts of the layout. So that's the paint I'm using. The paint's dried, and now I'm going to start doing the road, and for that I've got one of the Woodland Scenics road building kits. Okay, I've applied the Smooth It plaster, and originally I was just going to do the road, but it turned out I had enough left to do the hard standing area where the car auction is going to be, so I've also done that. Once it's dry, I will peel up the tape and sand the road surface reasonably smooth. I don't want it to be super smooth, as the road, this is a dead-end industrial road, it's not going to get a lot of maintenance, so I want it to have a few potholes and be a bit rough, so I'm not going for a crazy finish. And by the same token, the car auction area itself, I would like the concrete to be fairly worn down and abused, so I'm not going for a super smooth finish, hence why I have just literally just smoothed it out with the spreader onto the foam. So there's going to be variations in height on this area, and it should make for some interesting effects. while the plaster is still wet, any mess can be quite easily cleaned up with just a damp cloth. Comes right off. Okay, well, since peeling the tape off, I've done a little bit more work with some of the remaining plaster. You can see I've filled in a few bits and pieces, and I've also added some more Sculptamold to blend the embankment onto the edge of the road. I've given it a light sanding just to take out some of the surface imperfections, and now I'm going to give it a paint with a basic colour that I will add to later on. I'm not worried about finish. This is a lightly used, under-maintained road, and the yard that the car auction is in will almost certainly have various issues. So if anything, the worse it looks, the more realistic it'll be. The kit comes with some top coat. Now this is almost certainly going to be too black. It'll look too much like a new road, so I'm going to add some white in there to thin it out. Little trick you can do to get the paint looking better is to use some sponge. You can see all the brush strokes there, doesn't look brilliant, and then suddenly the finish improves. It's just using a piece of sponge. Okay, well that's the road roughly painted. I will obviously be adding extra effects to it. It's not going to be all one colour. Again, using the sponge method, I can do areas that have been re-tarmacked and areas that are crumbling away or cracked or faded or whatever. This is just to get the ball rolling, so I've painted everything the same colour. For the concrete where the car auction is going to be, I'm going to be painting it a little bit more of a concrete colour, a little bit lighter. I would like to experiment with making this a different colour to the road, so I'll do that now, and if I change my mind later I can easily paint over it with something else. Okay, there we go. That's a nice weathered sort of concrete finish. It varies in colour throughout the area as I periodically added spots of black into the paint pot and just varied where I was going with the sponge. So I've got some nice varied effects in there. Quite happy with how it's looking. The road and the concrete will be separated by a pavement, so that will break up the colours quite nicely. Just put a second coat of paint on the embankment just to get rid of some of the white foam and sculpt mould that was showing through. And now, while that's drying, I'm going to start doing some of the paving. So I'm going to start putting the curbstones in. This is something I've not really done on layouts in the past. I've never bothered to do the curbstones because it's a lot of effort to make them, quite time consuming, but I found that Scale Model Scenery make curbstones. So I've bought a packet and I'm just starting to rough out where the pavement is going to go. Over on this area I'll have the pavement stop about here, and this will be the area where the gate is going to be to get into the car auction. And the pavement will continue down the road over there so that there is pedestrian access all the way to the canal. I've also been working on the canal whilst I've been waiting for all of this to dry. And you can see I've put together the canal piling, which forms the sides of the canal, and this really makes quite a transformation. It makes it look so much more like a British canal as soon as you add that. You know, most canals in the country have got that sort of piling. It's by Scale Model Scenery again, and it is quite time consuming to put together, especially this much of it, but certainly worth the effort. It looks a lot more realistic with the proper sides that you would expect to see on a canal. I've built some sculptor mould up to the bottom of the piling. Again, that's reasonably realistic. It's quite common if you're at the controls of your canal boat to come up and moor and find yourself running aground on the mud at the edge of the canal where it hasn't been dredged. So a little bit of detail, you're almost never going to see it, but it's nice to know it's there. It's arguably a little bit too deep, but I'm not going to let it bother me. It's just the limitations of what I've got to work with here. It made sense to sit the base of the canal on the frame, and my foam was 50mm thick, so it is a little bit taller than perhaps it would be, but there are areas of canal in Britain that are deeper than other places, so that's the excuse I'm going to roll with. Okay, so I'm going to carry on with the pavement. Now the curbstones are made out of quite thick card, as you can see, and while it does bend, it only bends a certain amount before it fractures. So to get around this particularly tight 90-degree bend, I'm just going to wet this down with some water. Being card, it'll soak up the water and should become much more flexible for a short period and allow me to glue it down. Okay, managed to get it to go around the tight curve, so the rest of it should be fairly straightforward to lay. Any glue that went where it shouldn't can just be wiped off the road surface with a damp cloth. Okay, I've masked up the curbstones and the road, and now I'm going to fill the void in with some filler to create that style of pavement where you've got the curbstones at the edge, and then in the middle it's just some sort of tarmac that's just been poured in rather than a sort of block paved finish. There we are. No sanding required. I'll just let that dry, then it can be painted. Any lumps or imperfections that are still in there will just add to the used appearance of the pavement. Over here will just be rough ground. I don't want to try and clutter the place up with too much scenery either. I'm really pushing the less is more approach, both with the track work and with the scenery. It would be easy to try and squeeze something in here, but I think as just a patch of waste ground it'll look more effective. You'll be able to look across it over to the railway line in the background. Okay, things are coming together. I've done a little bit more scenery work, as you can see in this area. So I've got the canal facilities point building, whether it's toilet block or whatever is yet to be decided, but that is going to be to do with the canal. I've put some more sculpt mould over here to just sort of finish off the end of the road. It's going to be rough, unkept, a bit overgrown, and here I'm going to have some paving. Here again, just another little piece of rough ground to separate things out nicely. I'll have a fence running along the back just there. So I've got some of these paving slabs, laser cut. You can cut them all off and put them down individually if you want, but like that they're already perfectly aligned and they should go down there quite nicely. Okay, that looks good. Quite happy with that. I've deliberately not brought it all the way to the edge, as the canal at the moment needs to be removable, so I can paint it and add various effects. Eventually the canal will go in permanently and form part of this board. Right, well I've picked out the curbstones in a contrasting colour just to bring things out. Obviously it's quite light looking at the moment. It will be weathered to blend in a little better. And I'm just going along now, and anywhere where there's a bit of white that's not been painted or a bit of damage to the road, I'm just touching it in with a bit of black to look like a sort of a pothole, if you like, or a bit of road that's been repaired. I will add repair patches to the road as I progress with things, but for now I'm just blobbing them in with a little bit of black, and they'll be blended in later on. A good example of that is where a bit of masking tape down here has taken off some of the painted finish, so I can just blob that back in with a bit of black, and then it looks like a sort of honest tarmac bodge repair. Okay, well, I've done quite a lot of painting, and I'm quite happy with the effects. It's looking good. The little bits of black added into any imperfections has added a little bit of interest. Quite happy with how things are turning out so far. Okay, so now I'm going to apply some dirt texture. You can make this yourself if you want to. I don't have that luxury, as all the earth near me is clay. So I have got some dark earth scatter, which I think is going to do the job. To help the scatter bond a little bit better to the glue, I've got some isopropyl alcohol in a little nice spray bottle, nice fine mist, and I'm just gently spraying the area to soak the layer of scatter that's sitting on the top that hasn't bonded to the glue. It should allow the glue to come through and bond better to the scatter. You can see the white in there as the glue is being allowed to come through and bond to more of the scatter. I don't want all of the scatter to bond onto there. I'm quite happy with a more patchy effect. After all, I spent a lot of time painting the underneath. Also has the benefit of any scatter that's on the road will not bond, because this is not glue, and I can simply vacuum it up later rather than having to mask everything up and spray the area with a scenic glue. I've just started to do some of the static grass, and I'll move on to doing the rest of the embankment in a second. I've started things off with the 6mm static grass, which is from Mini Nature, I think is the company that makes that stuff, and you can see I've deliberately not carpeted the entire area. It's all too easy to get carried away with static grass and plaster the whole place with it, but it's important that the ground cover does show through in places. In some of the bare patches, what I'll do is I'll come back and apply some shorter static grass, which will look good in places like the edge of the road, where the grass is restricted from growing too tall by passing traffic and maybe even a bit of maintenance from the council. Okay, now the grass has been applied, I'm just going to use a small piece of plastic to gently encourage some of the grass to stand in the correct orientation, as when you put the grass down it will always stand perpendicular to the surface it's on, so the grass is sticking out of the side at the moment rather than actually facing skywards. Okay, I'm going to let that dry. We'll come back later and continue to add extra grasses and further effects. Okay, the glue's dried and I have just vacuumed off the excess static grass that has not stuck down. If you can, it's important to try and keep hold of the excess static grass, as you can see just how much I've collected. That will do quite a large area again, so you can make your static grass last twice as long if you are able to collect it. I used a piece of old fishing net just over the end of the vacuum cleaner. The mesh in the net was tight enough to keep hold of all of the grass. So now we've got the beginnings of some proper scenery. You can see how much more interesting it looks by not having the grass cover the entire area, having it patchy and dense in some places and light in other places. Just makes it look that little bit more interesting. So now I'm just going to add some much shorter grass into some of the bare patches to make this look a little bit more established. But already I'm quite happy with how that looks. You could arguably leave that if you really wanted to. I'm going to keep going and add further effects. It's also worth mentioning that I'm modelling a British scene in summertime. So traditionally in this country, when the weather is good in the summertime, you would expect the grass to be a bit more established than that. This is perhaps a bit more appropriate for winter time if you changed the shade of the grass. Okay, obviously that has to dry, and I need to remove the excess, but you can see the nice varied effect that we've got going on in that patch of waste ground. Certainly looks more interesting than the same grade of grass over the whole thing. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. That's the sort of effect I'm looking for. You can see there's still some patches of dirt showing through. We can leave those bare, or we can add additional effects and grasses and bushes and things like that, or we can just leave it as is. Already it's looking quite convincing. It looks best being viewed straight across the top of the grass. You can see all the varied effects in there, the different grades, different heights and different colours. So I'm going to continue to add some effects. One or two small bushes I think wouldn't go amiss along here. As it's a man-made embankment, you're not going to find big oak trees or anything like that, but small shrubs and things, quite possible they would start growing. Also add a couple of extra little bits of grass just to provide some final bits of detail. For the last few grass-related effects, I've knocked some of these little clumps of grass up. Just a clear sheet of plastic out of some packaging and a few blobs of glue. Go over the top with the static grass and you have some ready to pick weeds or like bits of grass or whatever you want. There's one just there, looks reasonably effective, and can continue to add to them. Obviously they'll need gluing down, but just peel them off, place them down. You can see already looks very effective. So I'm going to add some of those behind the building for some patches of weeds. So take one of those off, and as I'm going up against a brick wall, just going to cut one side of the circle of grass flat. That will let me push it up against the wall nice and smooth, and it will look like some weeds are growing along the back of that brick wall. Okay, I'm just adding a few more subtle effects. I don't want to go too far with it, don't want to clutter it up quite like the appearance that it has at the moment. So I'm just literally putting a very small amount of Woodland Scenics fine turf in a couple of the patches that are a little bit bald, just to add a couple of extra effects. Okay, I've applied some of that blended turf to various areas, and then I've just used a plastic pipette to just fill in those areas with some glue so that all stays secured. The colours I'm using is two different colours. One of them was soil, one of them was a slightly different colour. I've blended the two together in this container, and I'm quite happy with that particular colour. I use it for quite a few different areas. I've done the same along the back of the building here and out on this little patch of waste ground. A few more bits and pieces to add in that section just there, but overall I'm quite happy with the result. I don't really want to add too much more. A couple of bushes here and there, and that's about it. I don't want to go too crazy. Here's an example of some of the bushes. Just some Woodland Scenics fine leaf foliage, small amounts, just glued into place. And I've made sure to glue them onto the bare patches where the grass is not growing to give off the correct effect. There's just a nice little bit of detail, and that's about as far as I want to take it. So with that drying, I'm going to take a look at the security fence and start to put that one together. Again, this is part of that little bundle of stuff I bought from Scale Model Scenery. Some detailed instructions and the lovely smell of laser cut materials. If you've never smelt anything that's come off a laser cutter, you won't know what I'm talking about, but there is a very particular smell, especially with wood, when it's been through a laser cutter, and it always smells the same. Building this fence is quite tricky. In fact, it's very tricky, but my god does it look good. Certainly worth the effort. I'm using some rocket card glue to glue the very fine mesh to the fence posts, and just some of these little plastic clamps just to hold things nice and taut while it dries. The rocket card glue dries quite quickly, so I can work reasonably fast, but yeah, it's certainly very delicate, very fiddly. Next thing to do is to do the detail for the top of the fence, and that involves threading 3 lengths of fishing line through the tiny little holes on the top of each fence post. Okay, well, I've pretty much finished putting the fence together, and you saw I did a bit of ballasting and a few other bits and pieces in the background. So that's going to bring this video to a close for now, and I will continue to build up this scene in the next part of the layout build series. Still plenty to do. Obviously the building that is there, that is not the building I'm going to be using. I'm going to build something that's a little bit more in keeping with a car auction. Build something from scratch is what I'm thinking to do at the moment. And there's obviously weathering and extra detail to add all over the place. This is basically the bare bones have been put together. It looks good enough, but there's certainly more that can be done. So I'll leave you with a few closing shots of where I've got to, and we'll pick this up in the next part of the layout build series. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that one. I certainly enjoyed making it. Takes a long time to make these, as I'm sure you can probably appreciate, so it will be a little while before the next part in this series, but I'm certainly very happy with how far I've managed to get, and it's nice to finally do some scenery on the layout again. So if you're interested in some more content, there's a link on the screen for Dave over at Dean Park Station, who's modelling the same era in a different region. He's much further ahead than I am, so there's plenty to see over on his channel. I've also left a couple of links in the description for other content worth checking out. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.